Good morning and welcome, everyone. My name is Barry Pavel, and I'm Senior Vice President and Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security here at the Atlantic Council. I'd like to welcome all of you to our event on the future of counterterrorism 20 years after 9/11. This event is hosted by the Scowcroft Center's Forward Defense Practice and the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative, and generously supported by our partner SAIC. And this event will honor the 20th anniversary of 9/11 by helping us not just to remember the events of 9/11, but to chart a path forward for U.S. and allied counterterrorism policies, because the challenges are far from over. This morning, we also released on our website a series of 12 really interesting short papers on the same topic set that explore some of the very forward-looking themes that today's event will cover, and much more, such as the future of bioterrorism and insider extremist threats. For today's program, we'll be joined by many expert speakers, both virtually and in person, and I'd like to thank each of these speakers for joining us. I'd especially like to thank our first speaker, whom I have the privilege of introducing this morning, the Honorable Frances Townsend. Fran is a board director here at the Atlantic Council and the Executive Vice President for Corporate Affairs at Activision Blizzard. From 2004 to 2008, she served as Assistant for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism to President George W. Bush, chairing the Homeland Security Council during an absolutely pivotal time in U.S. history, particularly as it relates to counterterrorism and Homeland Security. Fran, thank you so much for joining us today, and it's good to see you. Before I turn it over to Fran to kick off our program, I'd like to remind everyone that this event is public and on the record. We encourage our audience to direct any questions to the panelists using the Q&A box, which you can find underneath the live stream on the event webpage. Be sure to identify yourself and your affiliation in your questions, and we'll be collecting them throughout the event to pose to our guests later today. We also encourage our online audience to join the conversation on Twitter by following @AC Scowcroft and @AC #ForwardDefense. Thank you all for joining the Atlantic Council for what I know will be an important and captivating event. Fran, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you for that very kind introduction. It's a privilege to join you all today for the future of counterterrorism 20 years after 9/11. On behalf of the Atlantic Council, I too want to echo a warm welcome to the incredible speakers, many friends and former colleagues, and a terrific audience that we have tuning into this program. Today, we are honored to be joined by President Biden's Homeland Security Advisor, Dr. Elizabeth Sherwood Randall, a panel of former U.S. government officials and many national security experts, as well as best-selling authors, Max Brooks and August Cole. Thank you very much to all for joining us, and we look forward to your insights. The event also features the launch of a paper series on the future of counterterrorism, which explores many of these themes we hope to touch on throughout today's conversations. Here at the Atlantic Council, our Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States, its allies, and partners. General Scowcroft was a mentor to me and to scores of others, and the center seeks to honor General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. The Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative similarly honors General Scowcroft's legacy, and particularly his tireless efforts to build a new security architecture in the region. Consistent with the Scowcroft Center's mission, the Forward Defense Practice is designed to shape the debate around the greatest military challenges facing the United States and its allies, and creates a forward-looking assessments of the trends, technologies, and concepts that will define the future of warfare. That very future is particularly important as we navigate a transforming terrorist threat in the 21st century. This Saturday marks 20 years since 9/11. On that horrific day, terrorists associated with Al-Qaeda weaponized U.S. airplanes, crashing two planes into the World Trade Center, a third into the Pentagon, and one plane, due to the heroic actions of its passengers, crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, sparing other Americans. These events killed almost 3,000 people and left our nation in a state of turmoil. The world stood with the United States in the immediate aftermath, and for the first time, NATO invoked Article 5. An attack against one is an attack against all. In the aftermath of 9/11, the United States picked itself up through a series of policy actions. President Bush declared a global war on terrorism, bringing U.S. troops into Afghanistan and Iraq. The U.S. Congress enacted the Patriot Act, the Homeland Security Act, and the Intelligence Reform Act. The nation reassembled itself alongside its key allies and partners. Of course, it's important to take time on this anniversary to reflect upon the past 2 decades and remember those who we tragically lost on that day. However, today's event is not about looking back at the U.S. response to 9/11. The 20th anniversary of 9/11 offers a unique opportunity to look forward, consider the future of terrorism, and reimagine U.S. counterterrorism strategies of today and tomorrow. As various events of the past several weeks and months have made clear, the terrorist threat is vastly different in 2021 than it was in 2001. While violent extremists continue threatening U.S. and international institutions, they do so in an evolved security environment. Tragically, the Taliban once again continues to advance their agenda in Afghanistan, breeding instability in neighboring nations and chaos abroad. The last troops in Afghanistan have come home. Meanwhile, terrorist groups are leveraging new means to reach their strategic ends. Emerging technologies like AI, non-kinetic, such as cyber attacks, and online platforms like Facebook and Twitter are being weaponized by terrorist groups. And the terror threat is no longer exclusively originating outside US borders, as the US Capitol attack on January 6th of 2021 made stunningly clear. Domestic violent extremism poses a distinct and sizable challenge to U.S. counterterrorism policy. We now find ourselves fighting on both fronts, both at home and abroad, against violent extremism. And while those ideologies are very different, their commitment to the use of violence to advance their views and agenda is the same. To prevent and prepare for the next unthinkable threat to the homeland at the scope of 9/11, the United States must reimagine its own counterterrorism policies today. And we must look at the tools that are required to fight both of these threats. They are necessarily different, but US capability must continue to evolve if it is to be successful. That is the central purpose of the Atlantic Council's paper series on the future of counterterrorism 20 years after 9/11. This series, which you can now read on the Council's website, includes 12 expert analyses forecasting the future of counterterrorism and sharing visions of the threats we will face in the coming years. You'll hear from many authors in this series today. I am pleased to introduce one of these authors, Max Brooks, to begin our program. Max Brooks is a non-resident fellow, senior fellow with the Forward Defense and best-selling author of World War Z. His fiction is not only entertaining to read, but also works to raise awareness on the issues of disaster preparedness, crisis management, and survival for the common reader. Today, Max will be sharing a synopsis of the short story, The Future of Counterterrorism paper series, taking us to June 6th, 2032. Max will share his vision of the terrorist threat more than 10 years down the road and along the path we're going to take getting there. Over to you, Max.
Thank you, Francis. So I've written a short story for the Atlantic Council, basically in the form of a future op-ed, where I am criticizing the media coverage of the 2031 domestic terror attack, which is the bloodiest in our history. A mix of 9/11, Oklahoma City, and January 6th. And my criticism of the coverage is the failure to assign accurate blame. Because when we look at what causes this fictional attack, we need to turn the mirror on us all. We are all to blame, left, right, and center. And so first I go after the right, obviously, because this is a right-wing, white nationalist uprising. And establishment conservatives need to own the fact that they took the monster into their house. All the old guard Republicans like George H.W. Bush and Colin Powell and John McCain, who would have never tolerated this kind of evil for a second, they're all gone. And the current breed of Republican establishment, just like the German establishment of the 1930s, thought that they could use these creatures and could control them once they were inside the house, and realized, just like the Germans did too late, that once you invite the monster in, you are their slave. And that is the problem with today's conservatives, that they will not confront their darkness, and they will not clean house. But while I am critical in this story of America's conservatives, I spare no criticism when I attack my own people, America's liberals, because we have a share of responsibility too when it comes to recruitment and radicalization. What I mean by that is unwittingly pushing young white men into the arms of the radicals, which is the tragedy of 9/11, because we on the left have spent the last 20 years talking about Islamophobia, not just because it's morally reprehensible, but also because it's dangerous. Because when you marginalize and demonize any group of people, eventually some individuals from that group will become exactly what you're afraid of. And so it's shocking and disappointing that we on the left could understand that so clearly when it comes to Islam and not to our fellow Caucasian Americans. We got that if you attack all Muslims, the only person you're helping is Osama bin Laden. But somehow some of us don't know, or let's be frank, some of us don't care, that if you attack all white people, you are helping the white supremacists. So I hit the right, I hit the left, but I also hit the center. And that's critical. And what I mean by the center is the tech giants, the social media barons, the people who give the platform to the haters and allow them to spread their poison, not just across America, but across the entire world. And when we try to take them to task, they throw their hands up and say, hey, freedom of speech. It's freedom of speech. That's not our job to police these sites because we're not the content creators. We just provide the platform. And while I talk about this in a fictional story, like everything I write about, I got it from real life right here at the Atlantic Council, because we had a forum on online radicalization, and I was sharing the stage with a guy from a previous administration who was transitioning from his fancy government job to his highly paid tech industry job where he was going to become a lobbyist. And he used that exact defense of, we just make the cardboard carton. We're not responsible if the eggs in the carton are rotten, which is the exact argument that the auto industry made in the 1960s and 70s, which was, we don't have to build safer cars. You just have to be safer drivers. And both those arguments stem from one single word: greed. All they care about is money. Our social media barons today could very easily clean up their own sites. They could police them, but that would involve hiring a whole new tech staff to develop new algorithms and new tech. It would also involve hiring new constitutional lawyers to go through our legal system and say, well, what exactly does freedom of speech mean? And no matter what they did, they would lose customers. And they will not do that, which goes back to what Tim Cook did during the global war on terror when he said, listen, I'm not going to let the FBI go inside this terrorist's iPhone because my responsibility is not to a government. My responsibility is to my customers. So at least he was honest about his greed. The rest of them aren't. The rest of them say free speech, when what they really mean is cheap speech. And just like the robber barons of the late 19th century, they don't care about anything except their wealth and growing their wealth. And they don't care who dies along the way, as long as they get to build a giant mountain of blood money. So in this story, I hit the left, I hit the right, and I hit the center. Because when it comes to future domestic terror attacks, we're all responsible. And if we don't realize that, if we don't learn from fiction, that fiction will become fact. Because my goal in writing this story was that hopefully the lessons of it will keep this story a story. That's all I get.
Max, thank you for taking us to 2031. And in the Scowcroft Center, that is a core ethic to leverage long-range foresight and to imagine the possible. So thank you. And for demonstrating how our policies and actions today will shape security outcomes tomorrow. If you'd like to read the story that Max shared, you can find it in our paper series on the future of counterterrorism 20 years after 9/11 on the Council's website. This series looks forward and forecasts the future of terrorism, offering actionable recommendations for U.S. counterterrorism practitioners. It features myriad experts throughout the national security space, each bringing a distinct vision of the terrorist threat in the coming decades and appropriate policies for mitigating that threat. 4 of these experts will now join our next panel. First, visiting professor and director of Georgetown's Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, Mary McCord. She wrote on the insider threat in law enforcement. Second, former Deputy Director for Special Operations and Counterterrorism, Lieutenant General Mike Nagata, wrote on the need for investment in non-kinetic counterterrorism efforts, which Fran Townsend mentioned in her opening remarks. Atlanta Council Senior Fellow and former U.S. Ambassador at Large and Coordinator for Counterterrorism, Nathan Sales, is third. He wrote on counterterrorism and great power competition. Their discussion will be moderated by Tom Warwick, a Senior Fellow here who led the curation of this series and wrote on the idea that the United States this year in 2021 is only between major terrorist attacks. Tom directs Forward Defense's Future of DHS project, which explores how the Department of Homeland Security can improve its policies and operations to effectively counter emerging non-military threats. Before we turn to Tom for this next conversation, please enjoy a short video which gives a glimpse into the Future of Counterterrorism series.
Every year, the anniversary of 9/11 offers the opportunity to reflect on how a then unimaginable threat forced us to reimagine the threats we face in the 21st century. This year, 20 years after the 9/11 attacks, the Atlanta Council will commemorate 9/11 a bit differently. While the default may be to examine the successes and failures of the global war on terror and the campaigns against Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and the Islamic State, we will look forward, informed by the past, but not beholden to it. While we must be wary of tactics like those of 9/11, new threats like the rise of domestic violent extremism pose a danger just as great as the one we faced in 2001. The 20th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks is indeed an occasion for reflection. It also provides an opportunity for provocative thinking about the future of U.S. counterterrorism and reimagining the U.S. approach to counterterrorism in the years to come. In connection with the 20th anniversary of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, the Atlanta Council will start by publishing a series of short 2-page papers by leading counterterrorism practitioners. This analysis will question the fundamental assumptions that guide the future of the U.S. approach to counterterrorism. This series is not about justifying past actions. This is about foresight, thinking unconventionally about today's and tomorrow's threats, and how the U.S. and its allies should take action, starting now, against violent and cyber threats to civilian lives, property, and institutions. The Future of Counterterrorism project will continue to lead efforts at the Atlantic Council to identify challenges and opportunities to contribute to a better informed, dynamic, and humane strategy against upcoming challenges, including the potential impacts of the Taliban taking back power. We are using strategic foresight, thinking unconventionally as necessary, and recommending what actions need to be taken now and in the future to prevent and protect American lives and institutions from the next unimaginable terrorist threat. On the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and beyond, take a moment to challenge past and present practitioners' thinking and forge a future for U.S. counterterrorism efforts for more sustainable outcomes that contribute to both our national security and a safer world.
Thank you very much, and welcome to today's discussion on the future of counterterrorism. Before we engage in this discussion about the future, I do want us to all take a moment just to reflect upon the lives lost as a result of the attacks of September 11, 2001. So let's just take a moment for the reflection that is due to those who lost their lives as a result of these attacks. Thank you very much. And thank you for joining us today. We're going to have a provocative discussion, as you've already seen. And we're going to take a look at a number of the things that need to be done to address the future of the terrorist threat. The terrorist threat, by definition, means attacks by non-state actors against civilian populations for political purposes. Today, the Atlantic Council has launched a series of 12 papers. We intend to have more come in the following weeks and months. But we have 3 authors here today to discuss important and different aspects of what many experts are thinking about and discussing about the future of counterterrorism. We'll have Mary McCord, professor of law at Georgetown University. We'll have retired Lieutenant General Mike Nagata, former Deputy Director for Special Operations, former Director for Strategic and Operational Planning at the National Counterterrorism Center, and Ambassador Nathan Sales, a senior official at the Department of Homeland Security, and most recently, the Counterterrorism Coordinator at the Department of State. I would invite you to submit your comments through the Q&A feature. We'll be spending about the last 25 minutes of this session responding to your comments and to the discussion. Let me first try to, as best I can, summarize what the contributors to our expert series suggest is a common series of thoughts about the future of counterterrorism. I'll introduce a few of these points. First, there's general agreement. The United States and its allies should not stay locked into ideas and institutions that arguably worked well enough over the past 20 years to prevent the kind of mass casualty attack like 9/11, but some of those ideas and institutions may no longer be suited to the terrorism threats of the future. Second, military power played a dominant role in US efforts against terrorist threats over the last 20 years. But the future of counterterrorism will require an increase in leaders' attention and resources to civilian security and law enforcement. Domestic terrorism in particular is now revealed after the January 6th attack as a major threat to American democracy. And that obviously does not require a military response. But what is the nature of the response that is required? Number 3, prevention needs to be an increasingly important focus of future counterterrorism efforts, as will building partnerships, both internationally and here in the United States. Number 4, terrorists will continue to try to innovate and try to surprise. The internet and social media will continue to be a way that terrorists use to recruit and to plot attacks. Those who are focused on counterterrorism need to use imagination and foresight to anticipate threats and get policymakers to focus on closing doors before attacks occur. Counterterrorism professionals will need access to and the attention of senior officials to make the necessary changes, including additional resources where necessary, to prevent terrorists from carrying out plots that today sound like speculative fiction, but that history over the last 20 years has shown can become terrifyingly real. Number 5, the system of designating state sponsors of terrorism made sense in the 1980s, but the world has gotten more complex. Terrorism is but one way that nations like Iran use non-military means to confront the United States and its allies. The US approach to state sponsors of terrorism, a number of our contributors suggest, needs to be overhauled and updated in order to address non-military threats from a range of nations. Number 6, here in the United States, all presidential administrations since 2001 came into office wanting to focus on domestic issues or conventional national security challenges like great power competition. The first 3 administrations of the 21st century ended up all being forced to devote considerable attention to counterterrorism. A good strategy alone will not defeat today's terrorism threats. So the choice is not between counterterrorism and other national security priorities. Both need to be addressed. The investments in effective counterterrorism today are modest by the comparison to the costs of wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the question always remains how to use our resources widely. Finally, provided the United States and its allies can make effective use of civilian security, law enforcement, and prevention programs, there's every reason to believe that terrorism can be reduced to the level where the threats can be handled by individual governments without the need for large-scale, decades-long military efforts like Iraq, Afghanistan, or the campaign to defeat ISIS. The Biden administration, working with its partners, needs to design the end state for today's terrorism threats, both international and domestic, and then fully resource those efforts and ensure they succeed. This is in many respects the challenge of the future of counterterrorism. Let me turn to our first panelist and call on Mary McCord. Mary, in your thinking, what is the aspect of the counterterrorism response that we ought to look at changing?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for putting together today's program. You know, my background is as a federal prosecutor and a Department of Justice national security official who, in my time as the acting assistant attorney general for national security, was responsible for counterterrorism prosecutions and investigations. And so even though our counterterrorism program, I think, has been very successful in the past at not only degrading foreign terrorist organizations, but also mitigating the threat of violence here in the homeland, there certainly is room for improvement. We saw from the past that oftentimes communities, in particular when we were talking about the international threat, the Islamist extremist threat, we saw that communities, Muslim communities, felt targeted both by law enforcement investigative activity and by governmental efforts to actually counter the extremist threat. Now, we have a rise in the domestic extremist threat. It's recognized by the FBI director, Christopher Wray. It's recognized by the intelligence community. And this is the threat of violence from white supremacists, other racist and anti-government extremists. And so we need to take some of what we learned, some of the mistakes of the past, and apply that here. That means we start from a place already in the US where there is a trust deficit between law enforcement and the communities they serve. We saw, again, in the past, combating the threats immediately after 9/11, this deficit of trust developed between Muslim communities and law enforcement. It's already here when we're talking about the targets of domestic extremist violence, often communities of color, LGBTQ communities, other immigrant communities. Yet these are the very people who have had a long-standing, decades-long distrust for law enforcement. And that has only been made more real to them when they see active duty law enforcement engaged in extremist activity, such as the violent insurrection on January 6th, the attack on our US Capitol intended to prevent the counting of the Electoral College vote that in order to bring President Biden and Vice President Harris into office. This type of active participation in extremist violent activity by law enforcement, it just drives a wedge, obviously, between law enforcement and the communities they serve, communities who are necessary to any effective effort. So my short paper is really about combating this insider threat. And many people say, well, First Amendment, don't these law enforcement officers have First Amendment rights? Yes, they do. But the Supreme Court has been clear that governmental employees, when speaking in their personal capacities on issues of public concern, their First Amendment rights are not unfettered, because if their speech, their association, it hampers the efficiency, the effectiveness of their government agency. And in law enforcement, we're talking about undermining the mission of protecting public safety. That is speech that can be constitutionally restricted. So I think one of the key features going forward that we need to address is law enforcement eradicating those who harbor extremist views, whether it's white supremacist views, Islamist extremist views, anti-government views. Those people need to be eliminated from our law enforcement ranks. And that needs to be public, and that needs to be transparent, and that needs to be a commitment at the federal, state, and local level. Only then can you start to build relationships with communities who we rely on to report suspicious activity, to report what they hear about someone who is on that path of radicalization to violence, and to build trust for those sort of countermeasures. So I'll leave it there, Tom. There's so much else we could talk about, but that's the focus of my paper. And the domestic threat is one that I've very much been focused on since leaving government.
Mary, thank you very much for those thoughts. General Nagata, let me turn to you and ask your thought on what needs to change in our approach to counterterrorism.
Thank you, Tom. It's a great pleasure to see you, Mary and Nathan. It's an honor to be on the same panel with all of you, and I share Mary's gratitude to the Atlantic Council for inviting me. I think the most important response to the question you just posed is the United States has to finally realize and effectively implement the realization that we, just like internationally, we will never kill and capture terrorists enough to strategically succeed. Inside the United States, against the scourge of domestic violent extremism, we're not going to arrest our way to success there either. Now, those activities are important. And as a retired special forces officer, I doubt anybody would be shocked if I didn't stipulate that it is sometimes important to hunt people down and either bring them to justice or prevent them from killing people. Saving lives and bringing people to justice is obviously very, very important. But if we have learned nothing in the last 20 years, we should have learned that it is not strategically decisive. I was on record as the director of strategy at the National Counterterrorism my last 3 years in government, saying publicly and reporting privately that despite the enormous skill and ability we have developed to kill and capture terrorists abroad or use law enforcement tools inside the United States to deal with the domestic variants, there are more violent extremists globally today than there have ever been before. So despite our enormous prowess in using some form of physical force, either military or law enforcement tools, to save lives or bring people to justice, it has not changed, it has not stopped the growth of terrorism globally. So the most important thing for the United States to now do, which we have rhetorically recognized for many years, but if you actually watch where our investments go and where our leadership priorities go, it is now time for us to turn our rhetoric about the importance of terrorism prevention into actual investments, risk tolerance, and policy priority. In my judgment, we have given lip service to these things more than we've been willing to do them seriously, but it is the only instrumentality that I am aware of that can actually solve this problem. It is the incredibly difficult, complex, and mostly local work of making it less attractive to take the path to violent extremism. Right now, by hyper-focusing on mostly kinetic tools, either military or law enforcement, to deal with terrorism, we have inadvertently allowed terrorism to continue to flourish around the world.
Mike, thank you very much for those thoughts. Ambassador Sales, let me turn to you and ask the same question. What do you think needs to change in the U.S. approach to counterterrorism?
Well, Tom, thanks for moderating this panel, and it's great to see Mary and Mike. Thanks to all of you for what is already a very provocative and interesting conversation. So, Tom, I guess the way I would start to answer your question is to say there's some things that don't need to change, and I think the most important thing that should not change is for policymakers to keep focusing on counterterrorism as a top national security and foreign policy priority. The hot topic of the day, as you mentioned in your opening, Tom, is, of course, great power competition with China. Every administration since 2000 has sought to make a, shall we call it, a pivot to Asia. This administration is no exception. And one of the principal reasons why President Biden was keen to withdraw from Afghanistan was in order to redeploy assets, both military assets, but also policymaker bandwidth to challenges associated with the rise of China. But of course, as we're already seeing in Afghanistan, counterterrorism and great power competition are not mutually exclusive. And China is using the chaos resulting from the US withdrawal in Afghanistan for its own geopolitical objectives. We're starting to see China message Taiwan about whether or not the United States is a reliable security partner. We're starting to see Beijing float the possibility of taking control of Bagram Air Base, which it certainly would use to advance a narrative of US decline and Beijing's rise. I think we can also anticipate that Beijing will seek to exploit Afghanistan's mineral resources, in particular rare earths. So I think the first thing that needs to change is we need to not change the focus on counterterrorism. We can use our counterterrorism objectives and efforts around the world, not just for the purposes of protecting our homeland and imposing costs on our terrorist adversaries and ultimately degrading and defeating them, but rather because our counterterrorism work around the world is an important part of our strategic efforts to build alliances, to impose costs on adversary nation states like China, like Russia, and otherwise to advance our geopolitical objectives. A couple of final thoughts on what should change. So the first thing I would say concerns kinetic and military efforts in particular. I think the era of large-scale troop deployments is over. We're not going to see, and we should not see, replays of the Afghan invasion in 2001 or the Iraq invasion shortly thereafter. Instead, I think what policymakers should use as a model is the Syria model, in which we deploy where necessary, and not every terrorist threat merits a military response, but where military efforts are necessary, I would envision policymakers pursuing a Syria model in which, rather than a heavy boots on the ground presence, we're deploying several hundred, maybe several thousand special operations forces to the front lines where they provide advice and training to local partners. So the model is working by, with, and through local partners in the way that we saw in Syria. That is a way of projecting American power in a way that minimizes costs to the United States, both blood and treasure. And as we saw with the efforts to defeat the so-called caliphate in Syria, it can be an incredibly effective way forward. The next thing I would say is to foot stomp Mike's point about the need for a whole of government approach to counterterrorism. Sometimes a military solution is the most important part of our CT response, but not always. And frequently it will be necessary for us to use other tools from the national toolkit, things like law enforcement capabilities, which Mary could speak to authoritatively. Also border security capabilities that DHS maintains. Sanctions tools and other instruments of financial pressure have to be front and center in our counterterrorism approach. And also counter messaging or countering violent extremism. To inoculate vulnerable populations against the poison of radical ideology. All of those civilian sector capabilities have to be deployed in a big way to complement, and in some cases, to replace a more kinetic military approach. The last thing I will say is modesty. policymakers need to have modest ambitions when it comes to counterterrorism. We cannot allow our counterterrorism objectives to swell and blossom into full-on nation-building projects. That's where we went wrong in Afghanistan. That sort of approach is not effective. That sort of approach is not sustainable in our domestic political arena. We should certainly make every effort to promote human rights and the rule of law, and those benefits are important side effects and ancillary consequences of our counterterrorism efforts, particularly those civilian sector capabilities I just mentioned, but those can't be the focus. The focus has to be narrowly scoped on countering terrorism and depriving our terrorist adversary networks of the money and intellectual firepower that they use to carry out attacks, recruit new members, and so on. I'll stop there, Tom. Thanks.
Ambassador Sales, thank you very much for that. Let me again invite everyone to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We do have time for a number of audience questions, which we're going to start going through now. For all three of our panelists, the thread that's common in several of the questions is the tension between domestic and international terrorism. A number of questioners ask which is more important. Others say, how should we give priority? Why are we giving priority to one when the other is the greater danger? And questioners, of course, have different views over which of those is the greater danger. But as counterterrorism practitioners, as people who have been at the table when decisions need to be made about relative priorities, I know all three of you have seen how these decisions actually get made. So in the same order we just went, Mary McCord, Mike Nagata, Nathan Sales, what is the right way we should manage the relative priority between domestic and international terrorist threats? So Mary, if I may start with you on that.
Sure, thanks. This is a great question. And obviously both threats are significant because everything international affects us domestically and everything domestically affects the international arena when it comes to extremists, regardless of the ideology. And one thing I think we should do to start even this discussion is make sure we understand what the difference is, international terrorism versus domestic terrorism. Again, I come from a perspective from the Department of Justice and the definitions in the US criminal code, which the definitions themselves do not create crimes, they're just definitions. And those definitions, I think, have outlasted any usefulness they ever had. Essentially, terrorism is defined in the US code as an act of violence in violation of the laws of the US or any state. So we're talking about like violent crimes, right? That are done with the intent to intimidate or coerce the civilian population, to affect the policy of government through intimidation or coercion, or to affect things like mass assassinations. So that can be done under our law. It's considered international terrorism if it is done essentially where there is a connection internationally to a foreign terrorist organization. So something is called international terrorism in the US, even if it is committed here in the US. So the San Bernardino shootings, for example, where the shooters pledged bayat to Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS at the time, just before their shooting. That shooting occurred right here in the United States, killed 14 people in the United States, but was considered under our law an act of international terrorism, triggering the types of charges, had the shooters survived, and they did not, that would have triggered the types of charges that we also apply to terrorists overseas. By contrast, the El Paso shooting, domestic terrorism under our law is defined the same way, intent to intimidate or coerce, affect the policy of government through intimidation or coercion, but it's when the activity is solely domestic. So take the El Paso shooter, killed 23 people, but not after pledging bayat to a foreign terrorist organization. Instead, he did it in order to advance his white supremacist agenda. He wanted to create a white ethno-state. He wanted to eliminate what he considered to be the Latino threat across the border. But in doing so, his own manifesto mentioned international terrorists, not Islamist extremist terrorists, but white supremacist international terrorists, right? The shooter at Christchurch, New Zealand, Anders Breivik, shooter, from years past, horrible white supremacist attack. So I think what this shows us is there really is no such thing anymore to just solely domestic extremist violence or domestic terrorism. Our white supremacist views, anti-government views here in the US, these have their counterparts overseas, just like Islamist extremism has its counterparts here in the US from the foreign terrorist organizations that originated overseas. So I think when we think about prioritizing, I think we need to think about the fact that these are all global threats. And so then the question becomes, what do we do to dismantle the organizations overseas to make them less threatening here domestically? And what do we do domestically to counter the extremist threat and make the homeland more safe?
Mike, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that while it is pretty clearly very convenient for policymakers to believe that domestic violent extremism exists on one planet and international terrorism exists on a different planet, it is both strategically unwise and, frankly, an operationally bankrupt idea. As Mary's already suggested, there is no effective way to somehow separate or segregate the world of domestic violent extremism from what happens internationally. These are entangled enterprises, activities, communications in ways that we're never going to be able to undo. And frankly, I think it's a complete waste of energy and time to try, because we won't succeed. Particularly, just one very good example is that, something that unfortunately ISIS was a world-leading innovator on, the world of inspired terrorism, inspired violent extremism. As long as the internet exists, that's going to be a real problem, and the internet does not respect any boundary. But more importantly, if you believe, as I do, that the most important investment we have to make now is not our ability to bring people to justice or to save lives, although I'll always stipulate those are incredibly important. If you believe, as I do, that the most important work we have to do is what we are the least capable of right now, which is to make it unappealing, unattractive, and undesirable for an individual or a group of individuals anywhere in the world to take the path of radicalization and ultimately mobilization of violence. This is what we're the least capable of. Then this is what we should be investing in. But it will require some very inconvenient and to some degree painful realities that we will have to grapple with. One is, and this is something I became convinced of in the 3 years I was at NCTC, I wish I could say we knew completely why people take the path to terrorism. The sad truth is we don't, not completely. We know some elements of why people take this path. But I spent some time while I was at NCTC trying to find out how much empirical research has been done on the question of why do people become terrorists. It is amazingly thin. It's shockingly thin. The amount of funded research that has gone into answering this question, whether international or domestic, why do people become terrorists, is so small that it drove me to this conclusion. The problem with doing terrorism prevention is we don't completely understand why people take this path. It's not that it's unknowable. It's just that so little resources have been invested in this. So that's one thing I would argue needs to happen, or we're never going to solve this problem. And finally, when it comes to dealing with domestic terrorism, the federal government is going to have to grapple with two very inconvenient realities. First of all, the federal government is mostly unwelcome in this space. It's not that it has no role to play, but as soon as the feds show up in a local community, they are automatically rejected. And in some ways, their presence actually makes the problem worse, although that's obviously unintentional. The second one is that finding ways to effectively use federal resources to do terrorism prevention is going to require a great deal of tolerance for failure. We're going to have to be willing to subsidize things that will not work in the interest of finding the things that do work. It's a little like riding a bicycle. In order to ride the bicycle, you have to fall off the bicycle. We're going to have to go into this recognizing we will have to fail often in order to succeed, which is deeply unpalatable for most policymakers. If you give the briefing about how you're going to fail repeatedly so that you can succeed, the usual answer in Washington, D.C. is there somebody else here I can talk to? Because obviously Nagata is an idiot. But we don't know how to succeed here. If we're not willing to fail, we'll never succeed.
Ambassador Sales, your thoughts as somebody who's served at senior positions both in Homeland Security and in the State Department. You've seen the domestic and international threats addressed in different ways from both sides. What's your thought on how we try to balance the U.S. response in this area?
Thanks, Tom. A couple of quick reactions to that. I guess the first thing I would say is there's certain tools that you can use for foreign threats that you can't use for domestic threats. But it's also the case that many of the most important counterterrorism tools we have are threat agnostic. So an example of the former, nobody is going to start droning members of the Atomwaffen group because we're not in a state of armed conflict with them, as we are with the Taliban, or were with the Taliban, still are with Al-Qaeda, still are with ISIS. On the other hand, there's a huge toolkit of civilian sector capabilities related to counterterrorism that apply regardless of the ideology that motivates a group's terrorism. So one example of this is sanctions. So during the previous administration, we designated a white supremacist terrorist group. It was the first time the United States had ever used its sanctions authorities to designate white supremacists. There's a group called the Russian Imperial Movement, based in St. Petersburg, Russia, which operated a paramilitary training camp. And it trained some Northern Europeans who carried out terrorist attacks in the Nordic countries. They've also been active as a Moscow proxy in the Donbass region of Ukraine, fighting the Kremlin shadow war against the democratic ally, the Ukrainian government. So I think that's a good example of how ideology agnosticism is really an important part of our counterterrorism toolkit. For years, we've used our sanctions capabilities against Islamist terrorist groups, whether Sunni jihadis like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or Shia militants like Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies. We've also used them against Marxist organizations, other left-wing movements from the 70s and 80s, also used against right-wing movements, and now a white supremacist organization as well. And you can make the same point about other counterterrorism capabilities as well, such as counter-messaging. We need to be doing that regardless of whether we're talking about an Islamist threat or a white supremacist threat or a Marxist threat. We need to be using border security tools to prevent travelers from abusing our hospitality, regardless of whether they come here motivated by jihad or motivated by Norwegian gunmen like Anders Breivik, right? So many of the most important tools we have, it doesn't really matter whether you're dealing with a terrorist of this ideological stripe or that ideological stripe, because we can use them against the full panoply of ideological menaces that we face.
So another question comes in, and I think, Mary, you're the person best able to address this question, although others may have comments as well. There are two dilemmas going on right now, one in domestic and the other in international terrorism. On the domestic side, one of the most important questions that many people are debating, discussing, or trying to grapple with is how do we deal with the need to take actions that respect constitutional rights, but nevertheless target those who go across the line into violence? How do we have terrorism prevention programs along the lines of what General Nagata was talking about, for example, without infringing on protected First Amendment activities? So, in effect, how do we achieve the right kind of balance between going after those activities that lead to violence while still preserving the rights of free speech that Americans enjoy? Mary, what is your perspective on that question?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So This tension is exactly why we don't designate domestic organizations as terrorist organizations. Here domestically, all people in the U.S. have First Amendment rights. That's not only rights to speech, but also to peaceable assembly. And so ideology alone will not should not trigger an investigation, and it shouldn't trigger any kind of designation as a terrorist group. So the Supreme Court, in upholding our statute that makes it a crime to provide material support to a foreign terrorist organization, made it clear that because that organization is foreign, it has no First Amendment rights. The criteria for designation are foreign, engages in acts of terrorism or has the capability or intent to engage in acts of terrorism, and is a threat to U.S. nationals or U.S. national security. Supreme Court has said because those organizations are foreign, we're not going to parse apart, even for a U.S. person who supports that organization, we're not going to parse apart the part of your support that is ideological from the part that might be monetary or providing services or training or anything like that. It's foreign, it's not entitled to First Amendment rights. The US can criminalize it. Supreme Court made it clear that would not necessarily be the case for a domestic organization because it's harder to respect constitutional rights and parse apart things like that. So I do think it would probably be constitutional, for example, to designate a domestic organization as a terrorist organization if that organization said, we have one mission and one mission only, and that is to engage in acts of violence in order to intimidate or coerce the civilian population or influence the policy of government through intimidation or coercion. Then it's clear they're about violence and they're about terrorism, but no organization is going to do that. So that's one thing. We don't designate because of this tension. When it comes to investigations, law enforcement cannot, by internal guidance, the FBI and other law enforcement cannot open an investigation based solely on First Amendment protected activity. So if all law enforcement sees, let's say on open source social media, is someone aligning themselves with, let's say the white supremacist views that they think that this country is being overrun by immigrants and that this is not what our country is founded on, and they align themselves with those views. That is something that you cannot start an investigation on. But once that person starts to talk about acquiring weapons for some type of crime of violence, planning some type of crime of violence, associating with others in order to engage in some type of crime of violence or other criminal activity, then it is okay for the U.S. to open an investigation, even though there are still some aspects of protected speech that might go along with that activity. You don't get a free pass to plan crimes of violence because there's a speech aspect to it. And the Supreme Court has been clear about that as well. First Amendment doesn't protect violence, doesn't protect incitement to imminent violence or imminent unlawful activity. And so that's partly where that line is drawn. And so the last thing is, so that does leave some leeway because, to be honest, working with the researchers I've been working with for years now, it oftentimes doesn't take very long for people to start talking about acts of violence. Those who are intent on really being part of an extremist or accelerationist group here in the US, whether it's motivated, whatever ideology motivates it. And the last thing I'll mention about this is that law enforcement should not be using the First Amendment as sort of a shield for not paying attention to the threats that are rising. It's right. You can't open an investigation into somebody based solely on First Amendment protected activity, but equally, you should not close your eyes to the type of rhetoric and propaganda that is extremist that we see on social media and, on, well, I guess it's all parts of YouTube videos, et cetera. That's the kind of thing that they need to be at least paying attention to without opening investigations, not ignoring, accepting information from members of the community who are providing it to them and watching those trends. We've watched those trends in Islamist extremism for years. We need to watch those trends in domestic extremism because that's the only way you're going to know to be prepared. Just one last point I'll make is that we've been talking a little bit about a whole of government approach, but also, and General Nagata foot stomped this, we've also talked how feds are often unwelcome. I used to say whole of government a lot when I was in government. I now say whole of society for some of the reasons that we've heard from others on this panel and from Max and Francis Townsend before that. Like, it's not just the government. Like, our tech sector has got to be very involved in this. our C-suites across every corporation in America has to really make commitments to how do they facilitate an environment that does not appear threatening to people. In other words, an environment that says, look, we can provide for racial justice in our hiring. We can provide for ability to make all people in this country, regardless of their race, religion, ethnicity, be able to have a chance to succeed. And it's not zero sum. It's not that if we provide opportunities for one, someone else is going to fail. That's going to have to come from people other than the government. And those are the kind of things that will be necessary if we're going to counter the problem here in the U.S.
Thank you very much, Mary. So the equally thorny dilemma question for Afghanistan. Let me start, General Nagata, with you, and I think Ambassador Sales may have a diplomatic and homeland security perspective as well. A number of questioners are concerned about the fall of Kabul and the effect that that's going to have on terrorist threats against the homeland. This, I realize, could be the subject of several complete sessions. But what is your perspective, General Nagata, about how this affects the future counterterrorism response of the United States?
Thank you, Tom. I should stipulate up front that I hope to be proven wrong in everything I'm about to say. I would actually sleep better at night, but you asked me a fair question, so here are my answers, plural. I think the first thing we are likely to see is a wave of inspired attacks as a result of what has happened in Afghanistan. Whatever our methods have been, whatever our decisions have been, I think that one thing that is already very vividly clear is how much inspiration violent extremists of many different varieties, not just the jihadist type, are taking from what they believe is the complete humiliation of the United States and its coalition partners in Afghanistan. Whether that's fair or unfair, accurate or inaccurate, inspiration doesn't have to be factually grounded. It just has to be inspiring. And so I think what we are very likely to see is a wave of inspired attacks from people that are taking heart from the humiliation and the perceived failure of one of the world's most powerful and arguably most democratic nations on earth. And I don't think it'll be just restricted to the jihadist variety. I think, I was telling a friend of mine, who knew nature abhors a vacuum? Who knew that? I think what we are going to see is organizations like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State do everything they can to reconstitute what we would call a sanctuary from which they can engage in all sorts of both regional and international mischief. We'll see how effectively they do it. Afghanistan's a tough place for anybody, including terrorist organizations, but they certainly will be unhindered by the presence of the United States and the rest of our coalition, because we're not there anymore. Whether or not they will be able to reconstitute an attack against the homeland remains to be seen, but I certainly think there is a very high likelihood they will reconstitute an ability to conduct transnational terrorist attacks. That's in many ways the reasons that they exist. So I'll be shocked if they don't try. And there's not much to stop them, frankly, at this point. But finally,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
But finally, I would just argue what I've said before. If the international community sticks to our go-to instruments of using kinetic instruments against whatever it regrows in Afghanistan, the best indicator of future performance is past performance. We'll be just as disappointed with our ability to reduce the scale and scope of terrorism as we have been in the last 20 years, because if we've proven anything, we can't kill and capture our way to success.
Ambassador Sales, the same question to you and an additional question. What do you think from the diplomatic perspective the United States should be doing about threats that may emanate either kinetically, physically, or through messaging coming out of Afghanistan? And then another related question is, your thoughts on the Afghan relocatees who are coming here to the United States. Are they a terrorism threat to the homeland? And Mary, you'll get the last question as well.
Thanks, Tom. I am afraid I'm going to have to agree with basically everything Mike just said. I'm pretty bearish on counterterrorism in Afghanistan post-US withdrawal. Let me say a few words about what tools we have in Afghanistan, and unfortunately, they're not that many and they're not that great at this point. The Biden administration is talking a lot about what they're calling over-the-horizon counterterrorism. That's really hard to do. In order to take terrorists off the battlefield. And Mike, I agree with you, that can't be the end all be all, but there's some people who need killing. And a lot of them are in Afghanistan. If you're going to take those people off the battlefield, you need a couple of things. You need really exquisite intelligence information about where they are located and what they are planning. And you need strike assets located nearby so that you can take them off the battlefield when opportunities present themselves. That is not the sort of thing that you can do using drones based out of the Persian Gulf. In order to find out, as the military calls it, to find and fix your targets, you need hours and hours and days and weeks of intelligence collection on their pattern of life. You need to know what coffee shop they're going to go to on Tuesday, and that might be different than the one they go to on Wednesday. You need to know what time they leave their house to go to the outhouse in the middle of the night. You need to know what time they drop their kid off at school, what time they pick them up. And the reason you need that is because you want to take the strike at the moment when civilian casualty risk is at the absolute minimum. It's really, really hard to do that, even when you have special operations forces located in a country, and even when you have dozens of drone orbits taking place every single day. When you're flying out of the Gulf, 8 hours into the country, 8 hours back, that leaves you, 5 hours of loiter time over the target. It is very, very, very difficult to bring the same sorts of capabilities in a situation like that. So I'm pretty bearish about what we will be able to do to, first of all, get eyes on a growing terrorist threat in Afghanistan, and second of all, to take action against it. And actually, let me answer a question.
And then the refugee and evacuee question.
I don't really have any particular insights on that. Tom, you're the most recent DHS appointee here on the panel. I think we'd all benefit from your thoughts.
All right. Well, I'm going to let Mary go first, and then I'll go last, and then we'll go on to another question. But Mary, your thoughts on the ability to screen people coming from overseas in terms of, is there a threat or what?
So, when anytime you have a sort of mass evacuation like this, the vetting, and again, I agree, Tom, you're better to speak to this than I am. It's going to be a challenge to do the type of screening that, ideally we would want here in the U.S. to ensure that we don't have any threat, that anyone who coming in has been, aligned with terrorism. Of course, we know Afghanistan has been a place that of refuge for a variety of different terrorists over the years. And terrorist organizations. And so, it's obviously something that's of concern. But at the same time, this was really a human rights, tragedy that has happened as the country fell to the Taliban. And so we have, I think, an obligation, a very serious obligation to, those Afghans particularly who aided and assisted the U.S. government in its counterterrorism efforts over the last many, many years since we've been involved there, 20 years. And so, this just presents a challenge. I think that, I think there's a tension between being able to do enough vetting and, leaving people literally, hanging out in airport hangars, such as at Dulles in Virginia and at military bases. And we have an obligation to ensure that the accommodations for them are healthy. They're getting healthy meals. They're able to have access to sanitary, hygienic conditions and showers and bathing and all of those types of things that are so important, because if we're going to do that vetting, we owe it to people to also be respecting their rights. Obviously, if it turns out that any of these people end up engaging in any type of criminal activity here in the United States, just like anyone else here in the United States, we will see, the tools that the U.S. government does have, law enforcement tools come into play. But, my expectation is that most of these people, given the vetting over there, the fact that these are people who aided and assisted the U.S., is that this is not going to be a large problem in the U.S.
So I realize I'm online with two former law professors or current law professors and someone who has taught at some of our finest national security institutions. So I would still give you all A's. In terms of the answer I would give to the last asked question, it is in many respects a function of resources. We have the capability and the systems that all three of you were involved in setting up, the ability to have enormous confidence in the screening and vetting decisions that can be made. It really comes down to a function of the resources, the people who are put on that process, and the time they have to do the necessary work. In this case, talking to former U.S. military and diplomatic officials who had contact with many of the people who are now either seeking to come to the United States or in some cases are already here. I saw that the Biden administration has signaled it will be asking for significant sums of money for the processing of Afghan relocatees. Provided there's an effort, which I think the Department of Defense would largely end up needing to staff, to try to provide the people who can check out the people who are here or who would like to come here, to run down their stories, to understand what are in government files and the statements and other evidence that's available. If the resources are made available to the screening and vetting process, then yes, I think the American people can be very confident in the decisions that are made. But this is, of course, up to the Congress in the next few weeks as Congress comes back. Let me.
Can I say one more thing, Tom? I thought of, and I'm sorry to interrupt like that. As we've been sitting here talking about the domestic threat, I think one of the things that's so important right now is to really beat back any type of notion that this evacuation and accepting refugees here from Afghanistan is a major national security threat, because that is just the kind of rhetoric that explodes through extremist communities and can make, and can be used. We've seen extremist communities in the US grab a hold of the issue of the day, right? A year ago, it was the pandemic and these restrictions by governors on our freedoms by requiring masks and social distancing. That became their coalescing force. And we saw them engage in violent attacks on state houses in Michigan, Idaho, and elsewhere because of those views. We saw the racial justice demonstrations after George Floyd was murdered as a catalyst. We saw the Stop the Steal false narrative after the election as the catalyst for violence, like we saw on 1/6. And so this type of, what's worrisome about, even having the discussion, I think we've all had a similar reaction to the discussion that, we need to have vetting, it's important, but we also need to be sure as former government officials that we don't ever say anything that would add fuel to disinformation and rhetoric suggesting that, terrorists are being allowed freely into the US. I mean, we know from other refugee programs that it's exceedingly rare that those people engage in acts of terrorism here in the US. Exceedingly rare. And that is a perspective that we need to, I think, say over and over and over again, so that this doesn't become just another excuse for people to be, anti-refugee, anti-immigrant, et cetera.
And Tom, if I could just piggyback on that, I think Mary's exactly right. The risk of terrorists exploiting refugee flows is very low, particularly in circumstances where the U.S. is using, in the case of special immigrant visa applicants, a 14-point congressionally mandated process, which actually is so cumbersome and robust that it stretches out the process several years. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that concerns about security risk here are not necessarily opportunistic or motivated by bad faith. Remember, we got the ISIS attacks in Paris and Brussels because ISIS was able to exploit refugee flows into the heart of Western Europe. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody who wants to come to America from Afghanistan is a risk. The vast majority of these people are patriots who loved their country, who wanted a better life for themselves, and who believed in America, and who put their lives on the line for the United States. And we need to honor that commitment with commitments of our own. But we also owe it to the American people to take their concerns about security risk seriously and not dismiss it out of hand, and explain to them exactly why we are confident that the screening mechanisms are effective and that we are going to be able to identify anybody who might be trying to exploit our hospitality in ways that ISIS fighters managed to carry out devastating attacks in the heart of Western Europe.
Let me, if I may, switch subjects then and talk about the question of state-sponsored terrorism, which Ambassador Sales, I know, was a subject that you worked on a great deal during your tenure at the State Department. Administrations of both parties have long identified Iran as the leading state sponsor of terrorism. And this, I think, is one that is a threat that must be seen as part of a larger picture here. In terms of the way to advance U.S. national security interests, where the administration is trying to, on the one hand, resecure entry into the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, while at the same time trying to address other kinds of Iranian threats in Iraq, threats against Israel and other similar measures. What is your thought for what is going to need to be the kinds of watchfulness that would be required now to try to persuade Iran not to use terrorism as a means of statecraft?
Well, I think that's an exceedingly tall order. Asking Iran not to use terrorism as a tool of statecraft is like asking a lion not to use its fangs as a tool of hunting. This is fundamental to what the Iranian regime is, and it's for that reason that, for 40 years, successive administrations of both political parties and every conceivable ideological stripe have agreed on one thing, and that is that Iran is the world's, I would say, worst state-sponsored terrorism. From the Reagan administration putting them on the SST list back in the 80s, to the Clinton administration in the 90s designating Iran's proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah, to the Trump administration's really robust, shall we say, use of terrorism and other sanctions against the Islamic Republic. I think we should not expect that diplomatic engagement with Iran is going to cause them to stop using terrorism. We took the Houthis, their proxy in Yemen, off the list of designated foreign terrorist organizations a couple of months ago. And as a result, we've seen no downturn in terrorist attacks by the Houthis. The Iranians and their proxies are committed to using violence against the United States, against our regional partners, such as Saudi Arabia, such as the UAE. And I don't think they're going to be talked out of it. Do sanctions work? Well, define work. I think at a minimum, terrorism sanctions deprive our adversaries of the resources they need to commit attacks. Hezbollah, for instance, has publicly called for donations because the support they previously got from Tehran really dried up over the past couple of years. Now, of course, Hezbollah is still a threat, and of course, Iran is still a terrorism threat. But I guess the point I would make is imagine how much worse that threat would be if the financial spigots were opened to full. Anyway, there's a lot more. We could have our own hour-long panel on just this topic, Tom, but I think I'll stop there.
Well, and Mary, let me ask you to address the way the United States has approached, as a matter of law, state sponsors of terrorism, because a number of the countries that have that are on the are or have been on the state sponsor of terrorism list, have checkered histories, and in some cases, countries that genuinely have renounced terrorism will stay on the list for years. Out of bureaucratic inertia. So the question, I think, is a legal one as to whether the U.S. approach to calling some countries state sponsors of terrorism, but then leaving them on the list. What is your thought about the legal aspects of how the U.S. government approaches state sponsor of terrorism?
Yeah, so, in terms of our authorities under US law, right, we've got the sanctions regimes that Ambassador Sales has already talked about, which can be effective tools. They are, Department of Justice, Treasury, State are all involved in implementing those. Those are implemented through laws that apply even to private companies, right? Not doing business with state sponsors of terrorism. So we're not just talking about tools that allow for prosecutions and investigations against individuals who are, involved in terrorist attacks. We're talking about sanctions that apply to, U.S. and non-U.S. companies and persons that do business with state sponsors of terrorism and have any connection to the US. So it's an incredibly vast and broad tool set for sanctions to apply pressure on companies. We're talking about banks, we're talking about oil companies, we're talking about telecom companies, the whole, what have you, right? And so we've seen that, and we've seen successful prosecutions against those who illegally engaged in certain business transactions with not just Iran, but North Korea and Sudan, when Sudan was on the list. And to that point, there are mechanisms for getting off the list. It can be cumbersome and tedious. Maybe that's something, and DOJ has a role in that, as do State Department, Treasury Department, Homeland Security, and other national security agencies. And it's a fraught topic, because obviously most countries want to be off of that list, but it's not enough for a new leader to come in and say, we're going to do the right thing. We're not going to sponsor terrorism anymore. Please take us off the list, right? The US needs to see that there's a real commitment to that, and that there's real efforts being put toward that before they can be taken off that list. Now, I will say sanctions in terms of prosecutions are matters of discretion. Prosecutorial discretion. And so sometimes that what is going on in any particular country can be considered in terms of particularly whether a criminal prosecution will move forward. There are also exceptions for sort of medical supplies and humanitarian supplies and things like that. So there is some discretion there. When it comes to designating SDGTs and things like that, these again, part of the sanctions regime, but also part of our criminal tool set. And so things can sort of escalate or de-escalate depending on, I think, the severity of the conduct. But I do think we have to be careful in not, taking places off of the list too quickly.
General Nagata, I want to start with you on a question that we received from Dan Kolba, MITRE. The question really concerns cyber terrorism and whether through social media platforms and others, we need to be concerned about not what our U.S. military would call information warfare, but rather the reverse side of that. In other words, terrorists' use of social media and other things in order to manipulate kinetic kinds of terrorist attacks. What sort of things can we expect in this area, and what should the United States and other governments try to do to prevent that kind of radicalization?
Thanks, Tom. As Nathan just said, this is another topic where we could have an all-day event just on this one question alone, but I'll try to be brief nonetheless. First of all, I think we will see a lot more of what we already see. The amount of cyber-based entanglement between an amazing variety of violent extremist movements, organizations, and individuals will only grow. And rather inconveniently, as I suspect most people in the audience know, but maybe some of you don't, the internet we're using right now is less than 10% of the internet. The vast preponderance of the internet is what is in what is called either the deep or the dark web. And while our ability to understand the volume of violent extremist activity in the deep and dark web is limited, because this is typically not what governments invest in either navigating or understanding, it's already very clear that the greatest growth in cyber-related extremist activity is not occurring in the version of the internet we're using for this Zoom call. It's occurring in the deep and dark web. And it's much harder to understand. It's much harder to analyze. And therefore much harder to contest, because this is not where our traditional strengths are. So to get to the second part of your question on this particular subject, governments everywhere, including the United States government, is going to have to undertake a labor of several years. Actually, this probably to cultivate a new generation of practitioners in government that actually understand what is happening in the deep and dark web. Right now, we do not have that ability in any significant proportion. But the other things we'll see is using the fomenting of violent extremism by nation state adversaries as a way of undermining the credibility, the influence, and the reach of the United States. Violent extremists are become increasingly useful and cost-effective proxies for nation states. Nathan held forth very effectively on how impressively Iran is using their proxies. But here's the sad reality for us. Non-state actors are becoming increasingly strategically powerful because the barriers to entry in dazzling technologies, much of which reside or depend on the internet, are falling everywhere. And one of the oldest truths about warfare since the dawn of human civilization is it's always very convenient to have someone else do your fighting, your bleeding, and your dying for you. And as these barriers to entry to increasingly powerful technology are falling for violent extremists everywhere, it is completely rational for them to employ those technologies, and therefore it is completely rational and predictable for our nation state adversaries to cultivate relationships with them, because it's much better for them to take on the United States or to undermine the United States than they do it directly. It gives them some degree of plausible deniability. They don't have to do the heavy lifting. They have to just have to provide the funds and the technology access. So to try to wrap this dismal picture all up, the new battlefield for the United States when it comes to dealing with terrorism is going to increasingly occur in the virtual arena that we are not as proficient in as we should be. Many of our nation state adversaries are going to capitalize on this weakness by employing activities by violent extremists on the internet. And we have got a lot of catch up to do. Right now, we are falling further and further behind.
Thank you very much, Mike. Ambassador Sales, we have a question that I think you're best poised to start off a discussion on. This is from John de Blasio of the DT Institute. He asks, are there any lessons from how the United States dealt with the period after the fall of the Shah of Iran in 1979 and the rise of the Ayatollahs in Iran that we can apply to guide our interactions with Afghanistan and the emerging government there now? Are there lessons learned that the United States should be thinking about as it tries to decide how to react to the rise of the figures that we saw in the interim government that the Taliban announced today?
That's a great question. And, I don't even know how to begin to do that justice, but let me take a very thin slice of a very complex issue. I think the most important thing we can do is take the Taliban seriously in what they say they want to do. Don't buy the charm offensive. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that Taliban 2.0 is going to be any different from Taliban 1.0. They just announced their cabinet yesterday. I think fully half of the officials they announced are on US or United Nations terrorism sanctions lists. I'm surprised it's that low, but that includes Mr. Haqqani, who's the head of the Ministry of the Interior. Read internal security there. This is a guy who's got a multi-million-dollar US bounty on his head. We don't need to really read the tea leaves because the Taliban is messaging loud and clear what their intentions are, and that is to restore their terror state. As we've sat here, I just noticed on my Twitter feed, the Taliban has announced that they will be holding the swearing-in ceremony for this temporary or interim government. Guess what date? They're also commemorating an anniversary because they will be swearing in their new government on Saturday, September 11th. So take seriously what the Taliban says they want to accomplish. The last thing I would say about this is I'm actually more pessimistic about the Taliban as they prepare to assume power and govern than we should have been in 1979. Because remember, the movement that led to the fall of the Shah was a pretty diverse and representative cross-section of Iranian society. And there were liberals and Democrats that opposed the Shah, and they eventually became marginalized and isolated by the hardline elements that resulted in today's Islamic Republic of Iran. But in the very early days of the revolution, what you were looking at in Iran was a broad-based popular uprising. That is not what brought the Taliban to power. The Taliban effectively staged an armed coup, displacing the democratically elected and legitimate government of Afghanistan. They are not part of a coalition. They are seizing power by force. And I think we should temper expectations accordingly.
All right. Thank you very much. I want to have one final wrap-up question. And I recognize Tom Clancy, the famous novelist, wrote a book entitled Sum of All Fears, in which he pointed out in the preface page, the title of the book comes from a British officer who says, if you gather together experts in military affairs from the Army, from the Air Force, from the Navy, and ask them what the threats are, you end up getting the sum of all their fears. And I recognize that when you gather counterterrorism experts on the anniversary of 9/11, there is something of the same risk. But I do want to, however, finish on a different note. I want to talk about what is the aspect of the counterterrorism picture today that gives each of our panelists the most hope for how the United States and its allies actually can overcome the current threats, both domestic or international, that they see coming out of terrorist networks and groups around the world and here at home. So what is it that gives you hope, Mary McCord, that the United States may actually be able to prevail against the future of terrorism?
Gosh, here I am being a big glass half empty person, and now you're wanting me to be glass half full, which I need to be more that way in my life generally, but in particularly in this topic. I mean, I think that we are seeing recognition, and it's been there in the past, but global recognition of the terrorist threat, again, across ideologies, which I hope will lead to more global information sharing and joint efforts to combat the threats. And again, I don't mean just the Islamist extremist threat. I think what we're really seeing now is a recognition of the other terrorist threats. And I know from all of my partners, and General Nagata, you would be able to speak to this, former partners at NCTC and in the IC, that, historically our information sharing has been better with respect to, this quote unquote international terrorist threat. And so that's an area of necessary improvement. I think that's already been improving, but that's something that I think that sort of global effort is what we are starting to see. And I have some optimism about.
General Nagata, where do you find hope in the U.S. counterterrorism picture today?
Great question. I have two sources of hope. One is Churchill's famous quote about Americans. Americans will always do the right thing after they have exhausted every other alternative. It's absolutely true. But I actually see on the horizon, the last alternative will eventually try, and then we'll start doing the right thing. So that gives me some hope. More seriously, and this is going to probably sound a little cynical, but I actually do see this as a reason for hope. I think we are going to prove to ourselves far more quickly than we realize that we are not going to arrest our way to success against domestic violent extremism inside the United States. We're going to arrest a bunch of people, and it will make us feel good temporarily until we realize that there's so many more after we arrest them. And we're going to quickly realize that while arresting people to save lives and bring people to justice is absolutely necessary, it is completely inadequate. And then the only place left for us to go is to realize that if we don't figure out how to invest in local efforts to undo the reasons that people take the path to terrorism, we're never going to solve this problem. That actually gives me hope, because like Churchill said, we will have finally exhausted the last false alternative.
Ambassador Sales, what gives you hope?
This is a great question. I wish we had an entire panel on this. I think what gives me hope is we're really, really good at counterterrorism. And what makes me worry is, will policymakers use the capabilities as effectively as they can be used? So when it comes to kinetic counterterrorism, over 20 years, our armed forces have gotten really, really good at finding where the bad guys are and removing them from the battlefield using a very light footprint. This is the Syria model that I described earlier, as opposed to the boots on the ground approaches in Afghanistan and Iraq right after 9/11. We're really good at border security. Our capabilities of spotting terrorists who might be trying to cross our border are so much greater today than they were 20 years ago. We're really good at using sanctions to destroy the financial fortunes of terrorist groups and the states that enable them. Lurking behind all of these capabilities, though, is the question, will policymakers in Washington actually use these tools, or will they move on to the next shiny object? Competition with China, competition with Russia, the hope of diplomatic engagement with rogue regimes. I think the jury remains out on that. But I think one thing that the American people can be confident about is, if the US government commits to doing counterterrorism, we can do it in an incredibly effective way. Let's see whether we do it.
Thank you very much for that. And I think that puts us in many respects where we need to be. There were extraordinary efforts that have been made since 9/11, heroic sacrifices, and many challenges overcome. In some respect, it's inevitable. We've seen a dialing back of some of those efforts and a recognition that perhaps in some ways we went too far, perhaps in other ways not far enough. But I do find that, as Winston Churchill and General Nagata have said, the United States eventually gets around to doing the right, or at least the better thing. I want to thank all of our panelists, Mary McCord from Georgetown University, Mike Nagata, former Director for Strategic and Operational Planning at the National Counterterrorism Center, Ambassador Nathan Sales, now a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council, former Ambassador at Large for Counterterrorism, for their extremely interesting and thoughtful insights into today's situation. So as we continue at the Atlantic Council to offer additional perspectives on counterterrorism, we want to make sure everyone is aware that we will be adding to the series that we have available on our website today. So let me turn it over to Barry Pavel to introduce the next item in our program for today. Barry, over to you.
Thank you, Tom, and what an extraordinary and thoughtful discussion. Shortly, we'll be joined by Forward Defense Senior Fellow and best-selling author August Cole. August's forward-looking works of fiction tackle themes at the core of American national security. He co-authored Burn In, a novel of the real robotic revolution, which explores a future where the science fiction of AI and robotics has finally come true. He also co-authored Ghost Fleet in 2015, which has been a must-read in the defense community since it was published as a quite accurate description of how a future war with China might unfold. Today, August will read a short segment of Burn In, identifying common threads among distinct domestic violent extremist groups, and will share his thoughts on what this means for counterterrorism policies After he outlines his vision of the future, we'll be joined by Dr. Elizabeth Sherwood Randall, President Biden's Homeland Security Advisor, who will bring us back to the current administration's core strategy and priorities. August, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Barry, thank you very, very much for the invitation, and I'm pleased to be able to talk to you all about some of my thoughts on the future of counterterrorism. You know, this is a week that obviously marks the 20 years since 9/11 attacks, and we're at a point where we're really trying to understand how to think the unthinkable again. We've seen an increasing amount of attention focused on the domestic terrorism threats that we can see, but there are plenty, as General Nagata said, that we cannot. For somebody like myself who spent years researching and trying to understand what a war with China might look like, to shift to the question of domestic terrorism was a pretty big pivot. But at the time, it felt like it was incredibly important because many of the forces that are out there shaping the country, creating pressures that are building and building, point towards the kinds of concerns that I once had about the way that the risk of considering China a viable strategic adversary might be discounted or undercut. You know, America is on the cusp of a revolution. Technologically speaking, that's certain with AI and robotics. We decided to write a story about an FBI agent and a robot partner trying to actually track down a terrorist who was fighting the future itself. There are such societal changes coming, and COVID has offered a very grim preview to some extent, that we really need to understand how we're going to be able to continue to support and sustain this democracy at a time when extremism is being optimized and weaponized for commercial and political and attention advantage. You know, this is the sort of threat that is very difficult to categorize because it doesn't fit into the boxes that have been established over the last 20 years. If anything, we've seen in the last year and a half is that this is incredibly difficult, even for our political system, to understand what violence starts to look like when it's introduced slowly into an ordinary political process, such as like a presidential election. One of my big concerns is, you know, looking at how the way that the income inequality we've seen in this country grow. We've seen the polarization, both algorithmically optimized and otherwise increase for gain. We're seeing the faith in the social contract effectively broken in large parts of our country. And the reason why this matters isn't just in a domestic context, but to revert back to the idea of conflict with China. If America is so brittle that it can't take care of itself and is forced to confront a more powerful PLA in the Pacific or in other parts of the world, let alone the economic and diplomatic measures that Beijing is advancing around the world, then we have a much weaker chance than we think to be able to prevail should a contest become a military one. I'm going to read a section from Burn In that describes the town that you all know too well, Washington, D.C., where the book is set. Special Agent Laura Keegan is at the Washington Mall at the largest protest that she has ever seen. And this is a gathering of people who have different grievances with the American system, different grievances that the deal that they felt like they were owed, whether it was going to the right school, whether it was having a job they once thought was secure, whether it was working for the right kind of company. And suddenly they feel because of these forces of robotic and software automation, they no longer have a handhold or a foothold in society. Before the memorial was an overwhelming crowd of people. For all the time she had lived in DC, Keegan had never seen a protest march this big in person. Yet this was different from the photos of the anti-war, civil rights, and women's rights marches she had only seen pictures of. Or rather, it was the crowd that was different because they all looked different. Usually protesters shared a common look or background. Mostly teens, or mostly women, or mostly pissed off farmers. But here was a skinhead geared up in a leather standing next to a thin, pale man in his 50s wearing a cheap gray suit, a Treasury Department lanyard around his neck. An elderly woman in a shawl carried a sign that read, "Income is a human right," and wedged herself next to a teen with beaded LED dreadlocks that blinked an image of the American flag. The two had locked arms and punched their fist into the air at the drones overhead, as if the power of their shared anger alone could rip them from the sky. Keegan snorted at the thought, not just the fantasy that you could will an algorithm to fail, but also because she'd seen an angry crowd in Riyadh do the very same thing right before they charged her checkpoint. She wanted to shout back into this crowd, "You still have it pretty damn good compared to the rest of the world." It didn't matter. Senator Jacobs offered something that had been missing for more than an entire generation: unity. The demonstrators were discovering what it was like to join together again with fellow Americans, distinct in their own prior allegiances and affinities. Together, they were discovering how being angry could become its own identity. Angry at the changes they'd seen play out on the news and up close, from the color of the water that ran past their city to the historic flood that had taken a chunk out of it. Angry at what had happened to the banks, the food, and even the air itself. Angry at whatever catastrophe was next. But most of all, angry at all the algorithms and bots marching a few Americans into the future while leaving the rest of them behind. They no longer understood how the machines worked, but they understood they were changing everything. It was one massive crowd of a people who just wanted to get things back to the way they used to be. Now, we all know there's no going back to the past, and the future is what lies ahead. And I like to say I'm an optimist who stares into the abyss. And so I would like to believe that there is a way forward out of the polarization, out of the extremism that we're seeing start to brew and foment. But we are, of course, going to have to consider the implications of this at every level of society. This isn't purely a counterterrorism problem. It is, as one of the prior panelists said, a whole of society problem to consider how we respond. Barry, thanks again for the chance to speak to the audience, and I wish everyone a very somber and memorable week in trying to reflect on the last 20 years, and over to you.
Thank you, August, for demonstrating the power of fiction, the power of your own personal creativity as tools for strategic foresight. Stories like yours are a helpful reminder that we've got to think creatively to prepare for and prevent the next unthinkable threat to our national security. Though often, I must say, fact, if you look at Afghanistan and what's unfolding in Afghanistan is as strange as fiction. So hello, everyone. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. It's a privilege to join you all today for the future of counterterrorism 20 years after 9/11. 2 decades since the unforgettable attacks of September 11th, 2001, terrorist groups continue to threaten the U.S. homeland and the rules-based international order. They do so in new ways, leveraging novel toolkits and acting both domestically and abroad. For example, who would have thought 20 years after 9/11, we would be in a position where Sirayuddin Haqqani, a designated terrorist with a price on his head, would be named Interior Minister of Afghanistan of a government run by the Taliban. The Atlantic Council has remained committed to producing rapid analyses as the situation in Afghanistan unfolds. The 20th anniversary of 9/11 offers us a unique opportunity to consider next steps for U.S. engagement on counterterrorism and security issues abroad, especially, but not only in Afghanistan, and on combating domestic extremism at home, particularly in the aftermath of the January 6 attacks on the U.S. Capitol. To expand upon these topics, I'm delighted to introduce the final speaker in today's program. The event began with remarks by the former Homeland Security Advisor to George W. Bush, so it's fitting that we end this session hearing from the current Homeland Security Advisor to President Biden, Dr. Elizabeth Sherwood Randall. Liz has an extensive and distinguished career working in the U.S. government. She's one of the finest public servants I've ever known. I've admired her and her thinking for many years. I'm honored to call her a friend. From 2014 to 2017, she served as Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Energy, implementing a new approach to emergency response for natural, physical, and cyber threats. From 2013 to 2014, she was the White House Coordinator for Defense Policy, countering weapons of mass destruction and arms control under the Obama administration. And from 2009 to 2013, she was President and Senior Director for European Affairs at the National Security Council. From 1994 to 96, she served in the Clinton administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. In that role, she was awarded the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service and the Nunn-Lugar Trailblazer Award for pioneering efforts to denuclearize 3 Soviet states. So Liz, thank you for your commitment to our nation's security. Thank you for your public service and also for your longstanding friendship. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Liz is the first guest of this level that we are hosting in the Council's newly renovated event space. which was designed to seamlessly incorporate virtual and in-person elements at our convenings. We have learned over the period of COVID that we can convene global audiences of sizes and dimensions we never reached before for meetings like this one. And I could not think of a more fitting guest to help us introduce this new space. So Liz, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you so much, Fred, and I am honored to speak at the Atlantic Council today. I want to express my great appreciation to Fred Kemp for his not only generous introduction, but most important, his extraordinary transformational leadership of the Atlantic Council. What he has done recently on thinking through how counterterrorism policy needs to evolve has been significant to us already at the White House. I know you formed the Atlantic Council Counterterrorism Study Group and indeed have many distinguished former US officials serving on it. Two of those officials are now two of my closest colleagues on the national security team, Russ Travers and Josh Geltzer, so I benefit from their input every day. Thanks to the Atlantic Council for what you're doing on so many fronts. I have to add that as a public servant, I am especially grateful that the Council continues to be a beacon for civil, nonpartisan consideration of pressing national security challenges, from energy security to the future of NATO, and to the topic that we are gathering to discuss today on the US counterterrorism mission. 20 years ago this week, I was preparing our youngest child for his first day of nursery school on a sunny California morning. As we always did, my husband and I turned on the news to assess the traffic that we would likely encounter in the San Francisco Bay Area on our way to school. Instead, what we witnessed were the horrific images of the Twin Towers crashing down, unfolding live on our television screen. The maliciousness of the multiple attacks that day, the human tragedies that ensued, and the collective strength of our nation in response resulted in a major reorientation of US national security priorities. Guided by the commitment to prevent anything like 9/11 from ever happening again, we remade our national security architecture. We rewrote our laws, restructured our institutions, and refocused our country on keeping Americans safe from terrorism. The prevention of another such attack was not a foregone conclusion in the wake of 9/11. Most people feared and many predicted that this country would face another terrorist attack on a similar scale soon thereafter, and surely within the next 20 years. The fact that this has not happened is due to the ingenuity and the dedication and the selflessness of countless national security, law enforcement, military, diplomatic, and intelligence professionals across our government and around the world over the past 2 decades. But 20 years on, our challenge is different. We've learned since 9/11 how to protect Americans from terrorism. It isn't fail-safe, and terrible things still happen. But through a combination of actions abroad and at home, we have thus far been able to disrupt and prevent another 9/11-style attack in the homeland. We face 2 intertwined challenges now. First, to counter terrorism effectively as the terrorist threat landscape evolves. And second, to integrate our approach to terrorism into the broader set of current and emerging national security priorities. Given this evolution, I'd like to outline 3 core principles of our counterterrorism approach as we have developed it since President Biden took office in January. First, terrorist threats have morphed and metastasized, and we need to keep pace with those evolutions. That means approaching counterterrorism as an effort calibrated not to contend with the threats that we faced in September 2001, but to the threats we face now and that we can anticipate that we will face going forward. Second, as a nation, we need to set priorities and match resources to a range of evolving national security challenges, from a more aggressive China to cyber attacks on our critical infrastructure to pandemics and biological threats. Third, effectively countering terrorism in the future and doing so in a manner that allows sufficient focus on other key priorities will require that we adapt our approach using the full range of tools at our disposal, including diplomacy, development, and prevention efforts, all in a manner tailored to the threats we face and the local contexts in which they arise. That in turn means integrating counterterrorism into regional strategies and nesting our CT efforts within a broader suite of initiatives and investing in an indicators and warning architecture that will enable us to understand the evolving threat environment. Fundamentally, it means building a counterterrorism enterprise that is positioned to detect threats as they evolve, flexible enough to adapt to changing threats, and nimble enough to tailor our approach to the threats we face in real time. Starting with the first principle, terrorist threats have changed and we need to keep up with them. Since 9/11, countering terrorism has been a consistent national security priority, and rightly so, and we've had significant success. We have degraded al-Qaeda and ISIS and reduced the threat of large-scale attacks on the homeland directed by foreign terrorist organizations. That said, we should not be complacent. The downsides of globalization have empowered individuals and networks, and as such, terrorist threats to the United States and its interests can emerge quickly and manifest themselves in many ways. Moreover, we have more sophisticated capabilities and more tools available than we did on 9/11 or even 10 years ago. We have a strong and effective counterterrorism enterprise that collaborates and innovates across the federal government, with state and local colleagues, with the private sector, and with allies and partners around the world. But as last month's terrorist attack against our forces performing a non-combatant evacuation operation at the Kabul airport demonstrated, terrorism remains a scourge. Compared to 20 years ago, the threats facing us today are more ideologically diverse and geographically diffuse. Groups such as al-Qaeda and ISIS have expanded across Africa and into Southeast Asia. Yet while al-Qaeda, ISIS, and their dispersed affiliates, branches, and networks worldwide still aspire to attack the United States, years of sustained CT pressure abroad have forced them to shift their operating models and constrained their capabilities. At the same time, enhanced security measures at home have made the homeland a more hardened target. In fact, the intelligence community assesses that the most significant terrorist threat to the U.S. homeland today is not posed by foreign terrorist organizations plotting from ungoverned spaces in faraway lands, but from lone actors and small cells, including at home, who predominantly radicalize and mobilize to violence on their own, some based on ideologies associated with al-Qaeda and ISIS, but others based on ideologies more domestic in nature, such as racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, including those promoting the superiority of the white race. What this means is that even as we continue to work relentlessly to stop entities such as al-Qaeda and ISIS from plotting attacks against us from afar, we also have to address the threat at home from lone actors. Terrorist groups who cannot physically cross our borders are doing so via the internet, recruiting and radicalizing on social media, and radicalizing on other internet-enabled platforms as well. That makes for a different counterterrorism challenge that involves information sharing with technology companies, for example, and community-based prevention efforts. The point is that as terrorism changes, so must we. And this brings me to my second point. As a nation, we need to set priorities and integrate our counterterrorism efforts into a range of evolving national security challenges, from a more aggressive China to cyber attacks, to pandemics and biothreats. Make no mistake, terrorism is a serious threat, and we will continue to take it seriously. We're looking at counterterrorism efforts within the context of the broader set of national security challenges we face and working to align our resources to contend with the full range of threats confronting our nation, including those outside what some may consider the traditional national security domains, such as modernizing our nation's infrastructure, investing in domestic innovation, and fighting climate change. This approach will necessarily involve hard choices about our priorities and where we invest our resources. This is a key reason that the President made the decision to end the war in Afghanistan. And as the President has said, we will maintain the fight against terrorism in Afghanistan from over the horizon, just as we will do in other countries across the world, working with partners with tools that are commensurate to the threat and without an American military presence on the ground. We have already established the over-the-horizon capabilities that we need and are adding to them in order to monitor and, when necessary, disrupt threats that may emanate from Afghanistan. And our diplomacy plays a central role on this front. Effectively addressing our other national security priorities will require a more sustainable and agile counterterrorism approach, focusing our efforts on countering the most dangerous threats to the homeland wherever we find them, and seeking innovative ways of conducting the counterterrorism mission, including empowering partners to address the terrorist threats in their own backyards so that the United States doesn't have to carry the entire load, and using the full range of tools in our counterterrorism kit. This brings me to my last point. Countering terrorism will require a new approach that prioritizes agility and a greater investment in a broader set of tools, including diplomacy, development, and prevention efforts both abroad and at home that can shape the environments in which terrorists thrive and recruit. A sustainable counterterrorism approach must be flexible enough to respond to threats as they emerge. This necessitates having fully developed indicators and warning to detect and identify threats before they reach the point at which they directly threaten our homeland or our personnel abroad. Even though we judge that the threat of large-scale attacks against the homeland is currently significantly diminished, we must remain vigilant, and intelligence will be key to doing so. A threat that revolves around people and networks is inherently challenging to detect, so we have to continue to support the intelligence enterprise and ensure that it has the resources necessary to perform its vital counterterrorism role. We also need to continue to invest in preventing threats before they become imminent. That will require that we use the full set of counterterrorism tools at our disposal. Though the military will remain an important tool, it should not be the option of first resort. That is why President Biden, at the outset of the administration, directed a review of the policies governing the use of force in counterterrorism operations, to ensure that it is generally employed only when necessary to disrupt imminent threats to our nation and our people, and moreover, that it is wielded in a manner that is consistent with our values. As we seek to judiciously use military tools in our counterterrorism efforts, we must also expand the use of the full range of non-kinetic tools and capabilities available to us to accomplish our counterterrorism objectives, particularly in areas that we assess are at greater risk of being exploited by terrorists who are seeking to threaten us. To ensure this more sustainable approach is rooted in diplomacy and prevention, we will be strengthening our international partnerships, as well as our partnerships at the national and local levels. This includes working closely with our NATO allies who have stood shoulder to shoulder with us in the fight since 9/11, and many allies who have faced significant terrorist threats of their own. And it includes working with local partners in regions in which terrorism is unfortunately spreading. We'll need to invest in building their capacity to prevent violent extremism. In both cases, we'll continue to prioritize information sharing, which has been critical to successful joint efforts over the last 20 years. The United States now has terrorist information sharing agreements with 80 countries. And we work with partners worldwide to detect and constrain terrorist travel by sharing U.S. and international data holdings. Turning to our efforts in the homeland, we have made enormous strides in strengthening our defenses through better border and transportation security, intense law enforcement efforts, and expanded private sector and community partnerships. Recognizing the evolving threat to the homeland, and one that is not only emanating from overseas, President Biden directed us to develop the first ever national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, which we launched in June. This strategy seeks to prevent, disrupt, and deter domestic terrorism by strengthening defenses and improving partnerships across the federal enterprise. For example, the Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and others are providing law enforcement partners with increased information sharing and instructional training to enable them to identify and disrupt domestic terrorist threats. And the Department of Defense is ensuring that service members who are leaving the military are aware that they could be targeted for recruitment by violent extremists. But this is only a beginning. We need to position and support our law enforcement and community partners to contend with a greater diversity of threats, including those posed by domestic terrorist groups, and learn more about how to build more resilient communities. The key to this effort will be strengthening prevention through education, community-based approaches, and other opportunities to counter the forms of pernicious disinformation, foreign influence, and hate speech that can lead to violence. This work is already underway. For example, the Department of Homeland Security is working to create safe new pathways that family, friends, and coworkers can take advantage of to share information when they have concerns that someone they know is trending toward radicalization. Meanwhile, we are also exploring new forms of collaboration with the private sector. In May, for example, we announced our decision to join the Christchurch Call, an international partnership among 56 governments and 10 technology companies, including Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, that works to develop new solutions to eliminating terrorist content online while safeguarding freedoms of expression. This framework was forged by some of our closest allies following the 2017 attack on 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, that left 51 dead and dozens wounded. What they have built has energized and guided an important global conversation about how to address terrorism threats online while protecting and indeed promoting the freedom of expression that we as Americans cherish. Looking ahead, this approach must enable us to be flexible and adaptable. We need a counterterrorism architecture that is not static, but rather one that has the agility to evolve as our adversaries do, and to be nimble in applying resources where the need arises. That's why we are vigilant about continuously monitoring and evaluating evolving threats and applying the most calibrated tools to reduce the drivers of those threats, and, where necessary, taking decisive action. I don't want to suggest that this will be easy. The factors and conditions that give rise to terrorism are complex and do not offer simple solutions. But this adapted approach is necessary to put us on a path that is both more effective and more sustainable over time. This week, we remember those we have lost. We remember the thousands of victims of 9/11 and their families who walk around every day with gaping holes in their hearts, and the many who continue to suffer from injuries from that terrible day. We also remember the thousands of American heroes who laid down their lives to keep the rest of us safe, and we remember our obligation to the Gold Star families that they have left behind. Since August 26th, we have also grieved the loss of 13 dedicated military service members who were murdered in the heinous attack in Kabul during our non-combatant evacuation operation. And as we have every day since 9/11, we have worked tirelessly to counter those who would harm Americans if given the chance, and dedicated ourselves to keeping our homeland safe. As I've emphasized, the 3 principles I've set forth will guide us. First is a commitment to keep up with and keep Americans safe from the terrorist threat landscape of today, not of 20 years ago. Second is a recognition that we need counterterrorism to be effective while also integrating it with the work we are doing to address a widening and diversifying range of national security challenges to our nation. And third is an increased emphasis on partnerships where we are stronger when we stand together. Looking back and looking forward, we know as a nation that we have the capacity to learn and adapt from our successes and our failures. In this realm of countering terrorism, we must continue to do both and remain steadfast in protecting our homeland and our personnel and facilities overseas from the full spectrum of threats that we face in the 21st century. And through it all, we must remain true to our values, those values that define us as a people and as a nation. I know that this day-long event is taking place in a location that includes a center that bears the name of the late Brent Scowcroft, whose generous mentorship to me had a profound influence on my life and my work. As Brent put it, America has never seen itself as a national state like all others, but rather as an experiment in human freedom and democracy. As we tackle evolving terrorist threats, both foreign and domestic, and as we meet the broader set of complex national security challenges that we face, we must continue to lead the world in advancing human freedoms and strengthening democracy that the world looks to us to uphold. Thank you again, Fred Kemp. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today on this vital topic.
Thank you for sharing your insights, Liz. We are so honored that you could join us today, and we all appreciate your unwavering commitment to U.S. national security. I'd also like to thank the many expert speakers who joined us today. I learned a lot, and I hope our audience did too. Today's discussions made clear that 20 years after 9/11, the U.S. still has much left to do to fulfill its evolving counterterrorism mission. This especially rings true in 2021 from the appalling Capitol attacks we saw earlier this year, which demonstrated the real threat posed by domestic extremists, as Dr. Sherwood Randall pointed out. To the more recent Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, it's clear that U.S. Homeland Security and counterterrorism practitioners face a varied and undoubtedly difficult set of challenges. I am reassured knowing that we have capable and dedicated officials and experts like those who joined us today grappling with these issues. I'd also like to underscore my appreciation to our great partner at SAIC, whose generous support made our event and paper series possible. Lastly, thanks to our audience and thanks to our great team, especially Julia Siegel and Josie Palaio and our events team for this event. And please stay tuned for more from the Atlantic Council on these important issues as they develop. Have a great day.